Welcome to the RPTM podcast, the show that breaks down the myths of monolithic history and tells our story through multiple lenses. I'm your host, Professor RyanGLancaster. Today's episode is partially underwritten by you, the listener. Find out ways to support the podcast on my website, RyanGLancaster.com. Episode 38, Fugitive Slave Act, Fredrick Douglass, and Anti-Mexican Violence. Welcome back those following in real time. It's been a few months since I've recorded an episode, and I am more than excited to be back. As we slowly creep our way into the 21st century of this podcast, we need to pause to smell the roses. But I guess in the case of history, we will need to smell the roadkill as well. But let's not pontificate. Let's dive in.
The Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act was passed by the United States Congress on September 18, 1850, as part of the Compromise of 1850 between Southern interests in slavery and Northern free soilers. The act was one of the most controversial elements of the 1850 Compromise and heightened Northern fears of a slave power conspiracy. It required that all escaped enslaved people, upon capture, be returned to the slave owner and that officials and citizens of free states had to cooperate. Abolitionists nicknamed it the Bloodhound Bill after the dogs tracked down fugitives from slavery. The act contributed to the country's growing polarization over the issue of slavery and was one of the factors that led to the Civil War. It is arguably the most openly violated piece of federal legislation in the nation's history. By 1843, several hundred enslaved people a year escaped to the North successfully, making slavery an unstable institution in the border states. The earlier Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 was a federal law written to enforce Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3 of the United States Constitution, which required the return of escaped enslaved people. It sought to force the authorities in free states to return fugitives of enslavement to their masters. Many northern states wanted to disregard the Fugitive Slave Act. Some jurisdictions passed personal liberty laws, mandating a jury trial before officials could move alleged fugitive slaves. Others forbade the use of local jails or the assistance of state officials in the arrest or return of alleged fugitive slaves. The Missouri Supreme Court routinely held with the laws of neighboring free states that enslaved people whose enslavers had voluntarily transported into free states, with the intent of the enslavers residing there permanently or indefinitely, gained their freedom. After 1840, the black population of Cass County, Michigan, overgrew as families were attracted by white defiance of discriminatory laws, by numerous highly supportive Quakers, and by low-priced land. Free and escaping blacks found Cass County a haven. Their good fortune attracted the attention of Southern slave owners. In 1847 and 1849, planters from Bourbon and Boone counties, Kentucky, led raids into Cass County to recapture people escaping slavery. The attacks failed, but the situation contributed to Southern demands in 1850 to passage a strengthened Fugitive Slave Act. Southern politicians often exaggerated the number of people escaping enslavement, blaming the escapes on Northern abolitionists, whom they saw as interfering with Southern property rights. In response to the weakening of the original Fugitive Slave Act, Senator James M. Mason of Virginia drafted the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which penalized officials who did not arrest someone allegedly escaping from slavery and made them liable to a fine of $1,000. Law enforcement officials everywhere were required to charge people suspected of escaping enslavement on as little as a claimant's sworn testimony of ownership. Habeas corpus was declared irrelevant, and the commissioner before whom officials brought the fugitive from slavery for a hearing, no jury was permitted, and the alleged refugee from enslavement could not testify was compensated $10 if he found that the individual was proven a fugitive and only $5 if he determined the proof to be insufficient. In addition, any person aiding a fugitive by providing food or shelter was subject to 6 months' imprisonment and a $1,000 fine. Officers who captured a fugitive from slavery were entitled to a bonus or promotion for their work. Enslavers needed only to supply an affidavit to a federal marshal to capture a fugitive from slavery. Since a suspected enslaved person was not eligible for a trial, the law resulted in the kidnapping and conscription of free blacks into slavery, as suspected fugitive slaves had no rights in court and could not defend themselves against accusations. The act adversely affected the prospects of escape from slavery, particularly in states close to the North. While prices placed on enslaved people rose across the South in the years after 1850, it appears that the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act increased prices in border states by 15% to 30% more than in states further south. In 1855, the Wisconsin Supreme Court became the only state high court to declare the Fugitive Slave Act unconstitutional due to a case involving fugitive slave Joshua Glover and Sherman Booth. They led efforts that thwarted Glover's recapture. In 1859, in Abelman v. Booth, the U.S. Supreme Court overruled the state court. In November 1850, the Vermont legislature passed the habeas corpus law, requiring Vermont judicial and law enforcement officials to assist captured fugitive slaves. It also established a state judicial process for people accused of being fugitive slaves parallel to the federal process. This law rendered the Federal Fugitive Slave Act effective in Vermont and caused a storm of controversy nationally. It was considered a nullification of federal law, a concept popular in the South among states that wanted to nullify other aspects of federal law. It was part of highly charged debates over slavery. Jury nullification occurred as local Northern juries acquitted men accused of violating the law. Secretary of State Daniel Webster was a vital supporter of the law, as expressed in his famous 7th of March speech. He wanted high-profile convictions. The jury nullifications ruined his presidential aspirations and his last-ditch efforts to find a compromise between North and South. Webster led the prosecution against men accused of rescuing Shadrach Minkins in 1851 from Boston officials who intended to return Minkins to slavery. The juries convicted none of the men. Webster sought to enforce a highly unpopular law in the North, and his Whig Party passed him over again when they chose a presidential nominee in 1852. The Fugitive Slave Law brought the issue home to anti-slavery citizens in the North, as it made them and their institutions responsible for enforcing slavery. Where before many in the North had little or no opinions or feelings on slavery, this law seemed to demand their direct assent to the practice of human bondage, and it galvanized Northern sentiments against slavery. Moderate abolitionists were faced with the immediate choice of defying what they believed to be an unjust law or breaking with their consciences and beliefs. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin in response to the law. There were several instances of Northern communities putting words like these into action. Several years before, in the Jerry Rescue, Syracuse abolitionists freed by force a fugitive slave who was to be sent back to the South and successfully smuggled him to Canada. Thomas Sims and Anthony Burns were both captured fugitives who were part of unsuccessful attempts by opponents of the fugitive slave law to free them. If fugitives from slavery were arrested and put on trial, abolitionists worked to defend them in the trial. If the recaptured person had their freedom put up for a price by chance, abolitionists worked to pay to free them. Other opponents, such as African American leader Harriet Tubman, treated the law as another complication in their activities. One necessary consequence was that Canada became the leading destination for escaped enslaved people, not the northern free states. The black population of Canada increased from 40,000 to 60,000 between 1850 and 1860, and many reached freedom by the Underground Railroad. Notable black publishers, such as Henry Bibb and Mary Ann Shadd, created publications encouraging emigration to Canada. By 1855, an estimated 3,500 people among Canada's black population were fugitives from American slavery. In Pittsburgh, for example, during the September following the passage of the law, organized groups of escaped people, armed and sworn to die rather than be taken back into slavery, set out for Canada, with more than 200 men leaving by the end of the month. The black population in New York City dropped by almost 2,000 from 1850 to 1855. On the other hand, many northern business people supported the law due to their business ties with the southern states. They founded the Union Safety Committee and raised thousands of dollars to promote their cause, which gained sway, particularly in New York City, and caused public opinion to shift somewhat towards supporting the law. In the early stages of the American Civil War, the Union had no established policy on people escaping from slavery. Many enslaved people left their plantations heading for Union lines, but in the early stages of the war, fugitives from slavery were often returned by Union forces to their masters. However, General Benjamin Butler and other Union generals refused to recapture escapees under the law because the Union and the Confederacy were at war. Lincoln allowed Butler to continue his policy but countermanded broader directives issued by other Union commanders that freed all enslaved people in places under their control. He confiscated enslaved people as contraband of war and set them free, claiming that labor loss would also damage the Confederacy. In August 1861, the U.S. Congress enacted the Confiscation Act, which barred enslavers from re-enslaving captured fugitives. The legislation, sponsored by Lyman Trumbull, was passed on a near-unanimous vote and established military emancipation as official Union policy but applied only to enslaved people used by rebel enslavers to support the Confederate cause. Union Army forces sometimes returned fugitives from slavery to enslavers until March 1862, when Congress enacted legislation barring Union forces from returning anyone to slavery. James Mitchell Ashley proposed legislation to repeal the Fugitive Slave Act, but the bill did not make it out of committee in 1863. Although the Union policy of confiscation and military emancipation had effectively superseded the operation of the Fugitive Slave Act, officials only formally repealed the Fugitive Slave Act in June 1864. The New York Tribune hailed the repeal, writing, "The blood-red stain that has blotted the statute book of the Republic is wiped out forever."
Fredrick Douglass. Fredrick Douglass was an escaped enslaved person who became a prominent activist, author, and public speaker. He became a leader in the abolitionist movement, which sought to end slavery before and during the Civil War. After that conflict and the Emancipation Proclamation of 1862, he continued to push for equality and human rights until his death in 1895. Fredrick Douglass was born into slavery in or around 1818 in Talbot County, Maryland. Douglass himself was never sure of his exact birth date. He was born Frederick Bailey, and took the name Douglass only after escaping. His mother was of Native American ancestry, and his father was of African and European descent. After being separated from his mother as an infant, Douglass lived with his maternal grandmother, Betty Bailey. However, at the age of 6, he was moved away from her to live and work on the White House plantation in Maryland. Douglass was given to Lucretia Auld, whose husband, Thomas, sent him to work with his brother Hugh in Baltimore. Douglass credits Hugh's wife Sophia with first teaching him the alphabet. From there, he taught himself to read and write. By the time he was hired out to work under William Freeland, he had taught other enslaved people to read using the Bible. As word spread of his efforts to educate fellow enslaved people, Thomas Auld took him back and transferred him to Edward Covey, a farmer known for his brutal treatment of the enslaved people in his charge. Roughly 16 at this time, Douglass was regularly whipped by Covey. After several failed attempts at escape, Douglass finally left Covey's farm in 1838, first boarding a train to Havre de Grace, Maryland. He traveled through Delaware, another slave state, before arriving in New York and the safe house of abolitionist David Ruggles. Once settled in New York, he sent for Anna Murray, a free black woman from Baltimore he met while in captivity with the Aulds. She joined him, and the two were married in September 1838. They would have 5 children together. After their marriage, the young couple moved to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where they met Nathan and Mary Johnson, a married couple who were born free persons of color. The Johnsons inspired the couple to take Douglass's surname after the character in the Sir Walter Scott poem, The Lady of the Lake. In New Bedford, Douglass began attending meetings of the abolitionist movement. During these meetings, he was exposed to the writings of abolitionist and journalist William Lloyd Garrison. The two men eventually met when an organization asked both to speak at an abolitionist meeting, during which Douglass shared his story of slavery and escape. Garrison encouraged Douglass to become a speaker and leader in the abolitionist movement. By 1843, Douglass had become part of the American Anti-Slavery Society's 100 Conventions Project, a 6-month tour through the United States. Douglass was physically assaulted several times during the tour by those opposed to the abolitionist movement. In one ruthless attack in Pendleton, Indiana, anti-abolitionists broke Douglass' hand. The injuries never fully healed, and he never regained full use of his hand. In 1858, radical abolitionist John Brown stayed with Fredrick Douglass in Rochester, New York, as he planned his raid on the U.S. military arsenal at Harper's Ferry to establish a stronghold of formerly enslaved people in the mountains of Maryland and Virginia. Brown was caught and hanged for masterminding the attack, offering the following prophetic words as his final statement: "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. 2 years later, Douglass published the first and most famous autobiographies, Narrative of the Life of Fredrick Douglass, an American Slave. He also authored My Bondage and My Freedom and Life and Times of Fredrick Douglass. In it, Narrative of the Life of Fredrick Douglass, he wrote, "From my earliest recollection, I date the entertainment of a deep conviction that slavery would not always be able to hold me within its foul embrace, and in the darkest hours of my career in slavery, this living word of faith and spirit of hope departed not from me, but remained like ministering angels to cheer me through the gloom." He also noted, "Thus is slavery the enemy of both the slave and the slaveholder." Later that same year, Douglass would travel to Ireland and Great Britain. The former country was entering the early stages of the Irish potato famine, or the Great Hunger. While overseas, he was impressed by the relative freedom he had as a man of color, compared to what he had experienced in the United States. During his time in Ireland, he would meet the Irish nationalist Daniel O'Connell, who would become an inspiration for his later work. In England, Douglass also delivered what would later be viewed as one of his most famous speeches, the so-called London Reception Speech. In the speech, he said, "What is to be thought of a nation boasting of its liberty, boasting of its humanity, boasting of its Christianity, boasting of its love of justice and purity, and yet having within its borders 3 millions of persons denied by law the right of marriage? I need not lift the veil by giving you any experience of my own. Everyone that can put two ideas together must see the most fearful results from such a state of things." When he returned to the United States in 1847, Douglass began publishing his North Star's abolitionist newsletter. He also became involved in the movement for women's rights. He was the only African American to attend the Seneca Falls Convention, a gathering of women's rights activists in New York, in 1848. He spoke forcefully during the meeting and said, "In this denial of the right to participate in government, not merely the degradation of woman and the perpetuation of a great injustice happens, but the maiming and repudiation of one half of the moral and intellectual power of the government of the world." He would later include coverage of women's rights issues in the pages of the North Star. The newsletter's name was changed to Fredrick Douglass Paper in 1851, and was published until 1860, just before the Civil War. In 1852, he delivered another of his more famous speeches, one that later came to be called "What to a Slave is the 4th of July." In one section of the speech, Douglass noted, "What, to the American slave, is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him, more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty, an unholy license, your national greatness, swelling vanity, your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless, your denunciations of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence, your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery, your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are, to him, mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages." For the 24th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, in 1886, Douglass delivered a rousing address in Washington, D.C., during which he said, "Where justice is denied, where poverty is enforced, where ignorance prevails, and where any one class is made to feel that society is an organized conspiracy to oppress, rob and degrade them, neither persons nor property will be safe." Douglass continued to speak during the brutal conflict that divided the still young United States. He worked tirelessly to end slavery and the right of newly freed black Americans to vote. Although he supported President Abraham Lincoln in the early years of the Civil War, Douglass would fall into disagreement with the politician after the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, which effectively ended the practice of slavery. Douglass was disappointed that Lincoln didn't use the proclamation to grant formerly enslaved people the right to vote, mainly after fighting bravely alongside soldiers for the Union Army. It is said, though, that Douglass and Lincoln later reconciled and, following the latter's assassination in 1865, and the passage of the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, and 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, Douglass was asked to speak at the dedication of the Emancipation Memorial in Washington, D.C.'s Lincoln Park in 1876. In the post-war Reconstruction era, Douglass served in many official positions in government, including as an ambassador to the Dominican Republic, thereby becoming the first black man to hold high office. He also continued speaking and advocating for African Americans and women's rights. Historians suggest that Lincoln's widow, Mary Todd Lincoln, bequeathed the late president's favorite walking stick to Douglass after that speech. In the 1868 presidential election, he supported the candidacy of former Union General Ulysses S. Grant. The latter promised to take a hard line against white supremacist-led insurgencies in the post-war South. Grant notably also oversaw the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1871, which was designed to suppress the growing Ku Klux Klan movement. In 1877, Douglass met with Thomas Auld, who once owned him, and the two reportedly reconciled. Douglass' wife Anna died in 1882, and he married white activist Helen Pitts in 1884. In 1888, he became the first African American to vote for President of the United States during the Republican National Convention. Ultimately, though, Benjamin Harrison received the party nomination. Douglass remained an active speaker, writer, and activist until he died in 1895. He died after suffering a heart attack on his way home from a meeting of the National Council of Women, a women's rights group still in its infancy at the time, in Washington, D.C.
Moby Dick. Moby Dick is an 1851 novel by American writer Herman Melville. The book is the sailor Ishmael's narrative of the obsessive quest of Ahab, captain of the whaling ship Pequod, for revenge on Moby Dick, the giant white sperm whale that on the ship's previous voyage bit off Ahab's leg at the knee. A contribution to the literature of the American Renaissance, Moby Dick was published to mixed reviews, was a commercial failure, and was out of print at the time of the author's death in 1891. Its reputation as a great American novel was established only in the 20th century, after the centennial of its author's birth. Melville began writing Moby Dick in February 1850 and finished 18 months later, a year longer than he had anticipated. Melville drew on his experience as a common sailor from 1841 to 1844, including several years on whalers and wide reading in whaling literature. The white whale is modeled on the notoriously hard-to-catch albino whale Mocha Dick, and the book's ending is based on the sinking of the whaleship Essex in 1820. His literary influences include Shakespeare and the Bible. The detailed and realistic descriptions of whale hunting and extracting whale oil and life aboard a ship among a culturally diverse crew are mixed with exploration of class and social status, good and evil, and the existence of God. In addition to narrative prose, Melville uses styles and literary devices ranging from songs, poetry, and catalogues to Shakespearean stage directions, soliloquies, and asides. In August 1850, with the manuscript perhaps half-finished, he met Nathaniel Hawthorne. This encounter may have inspired him to revise and expand Moby Dick, dedicated to Hawthorne, in his words, "in token of my admiration for his genius." Ishmael is the narrator, shaping his story using various genres, including sermons, stage plays, monologues, and emblematical readings. The novel has also been read as critical of the contemporary literary and philosophical movement Transcendentalism, attacking the thought of leading transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson in particular. The life and death of Ahab have been read as an attack on Emerson's philosophy of self-reliance, for one, in its destructive potential and potential justification for egoism. The book was first published as The Whale in London in October 1851 and under its definitive title in a single-volume edition in New York. The London publisher, Richard Bentley, censored or changed sensitive passages. Melville also made revisions, including a last-minute change to the title for the New York edition. The whale, however, appears in the text of both editions as Moby Dick, without the hyphen. Reviewers in Britain were largely favourable, though some objected that the tale seemed to be told by a narrator who perished with the ship, as the British edition lacked the epilogue recounting Ishmael's survival. American reviewers were more hostile. Moby Dick was born in the pre-Civil War churn of a very tense American consciousness. While it wasn't a critical or popular success upon publication, historians note that after World War I, Americans came to understand that it contained the makeup for much of what happens in the country where it was written. And historians predict it will cycle back to relevance under challenging times whenever Americans run into an imminent cataclysm. Moby Dick isn't simply the most significant American novel after all this time. Melville's masterpiece remains supremely relevant, a survival manual in times of crisis, a challenge to the Ahabs of every century, and an expression of democracy's divine equality.
Anti-Mexican American violence. The lynching of Mexicans and Mexican Americans in the Southwest has long been overlooked in American history. This may be because most historical records categorized Mexicans, Native Americans, and sometimes Chinese lynching victims as white. It is estimated that at least 597 Mexican Americans were lynched between 1848 and 1928. Mexicans were lynched at 27.4 per 100,000 of the population between 1880 and 1930. This statistic is second only to that of the African American community during that period, which suffered an average of 37.1 per 100,000 population. Between 1848 and 1879, Mexicans were lynched at an unprecedented rate of 473 per 100,000 of the population. Most of these lynchings were not instances of frontier justice. Of the 597 total victims, Americans lynched only 64 in areas that lacked a formal judicial system. Most lynching victims were denied a trial, while others were convicted of unfair practices. Josefa Segovia, also known as Juanita or Josefa Loaiza, was a Mexican-American woman executed by hanging in Downeyville, California, on July 5, 1851. She was found guilty of murdering a local miner, Fredrick Cannon. She is the first and only pregnant woman to be hanged in California. Not much is known about the early life of Josefa Segovia. The date of her birth is unknown. Josefa's actual name has been a topic of debate among historians and scholars. She was about 26 years old at the time of her death. She lived with a Mexican gambler, Jose, in a small house on the town's main street. It is not completely clear if they were married or not. Josefa was probably not married to Jose, but she did live with him. Therefore, she received a bad reputation. According to one account, Josefa was slender and barely 5 feet tall. The same account states that Josefa was beautiful, vibrant, and intelligent. Some say that townsfolk disliked her in the mining camp in Downeyville. Juanita had accompanied her partner to Downeyville from Mexico, and both lived in an adobe house. Celebrating the 4th of July, Cannon and companions were returning from the dram shop at a late hour, with Cannon staggering from the influence of liquor. Along the way, he stumbled through the door of the adobe hut. His friends quickly pulled him back outside, and they proceeded home. Mortified the following day of his embarrassing blunder, he moved to the house to apologize in Spanish. The Mexican couple did not go well, and Juanita grew angry. In a rage, she drew a knife and stabbed Cannon. The American mining population in Downeyville was enraged by Cannon's death. Josefa was put on trial the next day, and the jury consisted of Cannon's friends and companions while the rest of Downeyville waited for the results. Supposedly, a physician, Dr. Cyrus D. Aiken, testified that Josefa was not fit to be hanged. Protests immediately followed the doctor's testimony, and he was forced from the stand and the town. Moments later, Josefa was found guilty of the murder of Cannon. Also, Mr. Thayer, a lawyer from Nevada, attempted to testify against the execution of Juanita, but was beaten off the stand. Reportedly, he asked for a fair trial for Juanita to see if someone had committed a murder. For the lynching, a scaffold was constructed on the bridge over the Yuba River. The town came to stand on the riverbanks and watch her execution. It was an important event to lessen the anger of the townspeople over Cannon's death. Josefa was hanged immediately following the trial, and some accounts say that her last words before she was executed were "Adios, señores." She adjusted the noose to her neck, raising her long, loose braids carefully to fix the rope firmly in its place, and then, with a smile and wave of her hand to the bloodthirsty crowd present, she stepped calmly from the plank into eternity. Singularly enough, her body rests side by side, in the cemetery on the hill, with that of the man whose life she had taken. She is widely known to be the first woman to be executed by hanging in California.
You've been listening to the RPTM podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate us on whatever platform you're listening on. Join us again next week when we talk about the seen and unseen of U.S. history. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, for more information, check out the show notes on my website. The show was produced by me. Our editor is me. Written and researched by me. Music is Down South by Bliv Beats. I'm Ryan Lancaster, and this was the RPTM podcast.